same sort in earlier forms of human life. I also myself do not believe that the human soul is an entity that is totally separate or separable from the body. I simply believe that human beings and all living creatures have a spiritual component or a spiritual element. And in other words, I emphasize much more kinship among all living things than I emphasize distinction. It's obvious that in many ways we're distinct from other forms of life. You know, you're never going to have other kinds of animal life sitting in an auditorium like this having a discussion of the sort we are. Nevertheless, I do believe that everything that is alive has a spiritual dimension, and that in some way it's not human beings alone that could be spoken of as, to some extent, spiritual.
I wonder if I could just put in my philosophical comment. Why not? By the way, buy my book too. You don't have to read it, just buy it. And in fact, it's Christmas time, so if you want to buy a copy for your mum as well, that's fine, buy it. One of the things that one has to recognize in Christianity is that it's, to a great extent, it's an amalgam of Jewish thought and Greek thought. And people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas were trying to bring these two together. And often it was very successful, but there are times where there are tensions. I don't mean that they can't be resolved, but there are tensions, and the soul is one particularly. The Greeks very much identified the body and the soul and the living thing as one, as it were, unit. And that's, for instance, why Paul talks about the resurrection of the body, because for a Greek thinker like Paul, it would be incompatible to have an afterlife without a body in some sense. Whereas people like St. Augustine were thinking much more in the Platonic way, where you separate out the body and the soul, and they're two completely distinct things. So, in fact, Father Wiseman, he may be sounding a little bit unorthodox, but in many respects, he's drawing, I think, on a very deep Christian tradition. I think he would probably agree it's not the only one, but it's not a question of, pays your money and you take your choice, but these are different options that Christians and others have to work with. Just as a scientist, when he's got a problem, is it going to be natural selection? Is he going to say, no, that this is a byproduct of natural selection? And I mean, it doesn't mean to say that one solution is necessarily better or that they're all equal, but it does mean that you've got a lot of things in your toolkit to work from. Right?
Let me slip something in here real fast.
Buy his books too.
No, not only do I not only respect Dr. Ruse's works, I've used one of his books in a graduate course I teach at Catholic U. I think, though, just now you unintentionally slightly misspoke on one point. I think when you were, just so the students would get confused, when you spoke of St. Paul being influenced, I think you meant to say by the Hebrew tradition.
Yes, I'm sorry.
You said Greek.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, I meant the Hebrew tradition. I mean, no. Whatever. Look, if you're a philosopher, facts don't count. It's just, it's like politics. It's just a question of, sounding wise and staying up aboard.
Sure, right here.
Joseph Campbell speaks of creation mythology as the science of the ancients. Would you consider the Bible a mythological and philosophical work which should be read as the epics of ancient cultures are today, or the epic of our own time? I know it's not exactly an epic.
I also teach at my own monastery's high school, and we're doing world religions. And we're just ready to enter the final part of the course, which is on the primal religions. Now, by primal religion, I refer to those that do not have their own written scriptures. For example, the Australian Aborigines or many of the North American Indians and so forth. But we do know something of their belief through anthropologists and other scientists who have gone and listened to these people orally recount their myths, their epics, if you will. And what I find so interesting, and Jeff and I are going to see this in class next week, if you look at some of the myths, say of the Maori people of New Zealand or the Dayak tribes of Borneo, they're dealing with the same kinds of questions that you find in the Bible or in the Quran or in some of the scriptures of the historical religions. The basic religious questions throughout history, and there have probably been thousands of religions, have been, where does it all come from? Who am I? What does it mean to be a human being? How should I live? What comes after death? Those are the kinds of questions that the Bible answers in its own way, but not all that differently from what many of the other scriptures respond to. And those are the basic questions of human life. And so I think that, to me, that's what the Bible is.
Can I just add sort of a personal note? As you can imagine, having been brought up as a Quaker just after the Second World War, Quakers, of course, are pacifists. And I was taught, at least at one level, in a fairly literal way about the Bible, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, about turning the other cheek and these sorts of things. But as one, as it were, reads the Bible more and more, one starts to see that these things are a lot more complex than simply pulling passages out, even passages that Jesus said just like that and saying, this is the way that we've got to deal with life. I mean, for instance, at one point, Jesus says, leave your wife, leave your parents, turn your backs on everybody. Now, I don't call that a particularly moral sort of way. St. Paul says the very opposite. He says we've got obligations. So what I would want to say is that you read the Bible not for instant insights into this is what I should do because it says so in Galatians 3:14 or something along those lines, but that as one sees, let's say, Joseph and his brothers trying to work things out, or in that case, not working things out, and then forgiveness, and these sorts of things, I think that this is the way to read the Bible. Myth, but it's the way that you read great literature, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's Dickens, whether it's Tolstoy, and you put these things together, not just like that, but as an overall package, very much, I think, as a scientist would. I mean, he finds some discovery and says, gosh, this is terrific. But then, as it were, the next day you come in and you realize, yes, but this is not going to, get him on the back of the £10 note like Charles Darwin is, but that it's going to be part of a bigger picture, and we're always trying to work on small things to give us the overall view.
My question is, how can we put those more together? Say if before we didn't call it evolution, or maybe we did call it evolution, but we brought in this was God's divine plan, and he made us change because of all this stuff. Would there be such a division between that?
I think you're still asking this question of accommodating both. Is that right? Of accommodating both. And I think what I was trying to say earlier, reason why I thought I understood Father Wiseman's position is I was taught evolution by ordained priests. For many denominations, for many decades in this country, there's been an accommodation. And I think it's a very interesting understanding to reach in terms of those individuals who hold both views, are very serious religious people, and fully accept the scientific position. Part of this exercise, I think, is to expose you and other people in the viewing audience to that line of thought, which I think has just not been put out there in the public in public forums. I'm going to just follow up because I have a whole bunch of quotes from religious leaders that maybe will just, if you were brought up hearing these words, you or your family or any of your families, you might be thinking something different. And this is from the Bishop of Oxford. This is from the Anglican Church. So this was a BBC Thought for the Day in 2002, and it was in reaction to a movement in one school in England to, pretty much reject the teaching of evolutionary theory. And what the Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harries, pointed out, he said, quote, "The theory of evolution, far from undermining faith, deepens it." This was quickly seen by Frederick Temple, later Archbishop of Canterbury, who said that God doesn't just make the world, he does something even more wonderful. He makes the world make itself. God has given creation a real independence, and the miraculous fact is that working in relation to this independent life, God has, as it were, woven creation from the bottom upwards, with matter giving rise to life, life giving rise to conscious, reflective existence in the likes of you and me. And then he goes on, and I'm not going to go over the rest of the quote about talking about the Bible, but he asks, do people really think that there's a worldwide scientific community is engaged in a massive conspiracy to hoodwink the rest of us? And so I think I've seen when members of the clergy and leaders of the clergy articulate a position that is serious